It was a house that looked ordinary from the outside. A quiet street, well-kept lawns, the kind of home where neighbors exchanged polite greetings. But inside, something was horribly wrong. For weeks, the doors remained closed. The light stayed on. The mail stacked up. No one answered. And still, the world outside went on, oblivious to the silence within. Then, on November 9, 1971, the police finally entered this mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. What they found froze the community in disbelief. 5 bodies. A mother. A father. 3 children. All of them gone, yet eerily undisturbed. And one man, the one person who should have been there to protect them, was nowhere to be found. His name was John List. A man respected in his community. A Sunday school teacher. A devoted husband. A loving father, or so everyone thought. How does a man, a father, a man of faith, murder his entire family and vanish without a trace, leaving the world to wonder, for nearly 2 decades, where he had gone? Tonight on Dark Crime Case Files, we uncover the chilling story of the List family murders. The planning, the perfect silence, the long disappearance, and the shocking capture that finally brought a cold, calculated killer to justice. John List, the family annihilator. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, into a strict and orderly German-American household. From an early age, discipline and adherence to rules shaped his world. His father, a stern man who valued tradition and morality, instilled in John a sense of responsibility and the belief that personal failure was unacceptable. These formative experiences molded him into someone who prized structure, predictability, and control above all else. List excelled in academics, showing an aptitude for mathematics and organization. He went on to attend the University of Michigan, where he earned degrees in business and accounting. After graduation, he entered the banking world, slowly building a career that would see him rise to the position of vice president and accountant at a local bank in New Jersey. Colleagues described him as methodical, precise, and exceptionally reliable, a man whose personal discipline extended into every aspect of his professional life. Beyond his career, List cultivated a public image of devotion and morality. He was a devout Lutheran, serving as a Sunday school teacher, choir member, and mentor to local youth through organizations such as the Boy Scouts. Neighbors recalled him as quiet, courteous, and deeply committed to his community. To them, John List embodied the ideals of responsibility, faith, and family values. Yet beneath this composed exterior, there were subtle indications of tension. List was a man obsessed with perfection and order, and he applied this rigor not only to himself but to everyone around him. He held strict standards for his family, expecting his wife and children to adhere to a moral code he considered absolute. Even minor deviations, financial mistakes, rebellious behavior, or what he perceived as spiritual failings, were sources of intense private frustration. Financial pressures began to mount as well. Despite a well-paying job and a sizable home, List struggled with debts, including mortgages and daily expenses. He was meticulous about appearances, often going to great lengths to maintain a facade of stability while quietly worrying about the family's financial decline. Psychologically, List was increasingly isolated in his thinking. He combined his religious fervor with an obsessive sense of duty and moral judgment, which eventually warped into a conviction that extreme measures were sometimes necessary to correct what he saw as wrongdoing. While neighbors and friends saw only a model citizen, inside his home, List wrestled with growing fears that his family was drifting away from the principles he valued most and that their spiritual and moral decline was inevitable unless decisive action was taken. By the time the events of November 1971 approached, John List had meticulously constructed an inner world governed by control, discipline, and faith, a world where he alone believed he knew what was right. It was within this tightly controlled universe that the seeds of one of the most chilling and calculated crimes in American history were sown. By the early 1970s, John List's family had settled into a life that, to the outside world, seemed the picture of suburban perfection. The family resided in a large, elegant mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, a 19-room home that reflected both their social standing and John List's love for order and control. Every aspect of the house, from the polished wood floors to the meticulously arranged furniture, mirrored his exacting nature. To neighbors, it was a stately and welcoming home. Inside, however, life followed a strict rhythm dictated by John's uncompromising standards. The household was composed of 5 family members, each bound to the routines and expectations that List imposed. His wife, Helen List, was a devoted mother and homemaker. By many accounts, she was quiet and attentive, managing the household and the children's schedules with diligence. But beneath her composed exterior, she sometimes struggled with the pressures of living under John's exacting eye. Tension occasionally simmered between the couple, especially over matters of faith, discipline, and financial management. Then there was Alma List, John's elderly mother, who also lived in the mansion. Alma's presence added another layer of responsibility for John. She relied on him for support and daily care, and though she was a matriarchal figure in the home, her needs contributed to the mounting pressures that John felt in maintaining control over the household. The 3 children, Patricia, 16, John Jr., 15, and Frederick, 13, were described by friends and acquaintances as bright, normal teenagers, each pursuing their own interests. Patricia was a thoughtful and obedient daughter who often spent time at school and church activities. John Jr. was athletic and socially outgoing, while Frederick was the youngest, sensitive and quiet, often caught between the demands of his older siblings and the rigid expectations of his father. Despite the veneer of normalcy, the family's daily life was tightly choreographed. Mornings began early, with everyone following strict routines. Breakfasts were structured, dress and appearance were monitored, and the children were expected to adhere to both moral and behavioral standards that mirrored John's uncompromising worldview. Even small deviations, like leaving a dish in the sink or misplacing a book, were quietly noted. The house itself was more than just a residence. It was an extension of John List's personality. Every room reflected his need for control. The music rooms, the study, the carefully arranged dining area, all stood as symbols of order, predictability, and discipline. In the quiet corners of the home, however, one could glimpse the subtle tension that permeated daily life. The children, though loved, lived in a world where missteps were rarely tolerated and the weight of moral expectation was constant. Outside the walls of the mansion, the List family maintained a reputation of respectability. They attended church regularly, hosted gatherings, and appeared active in the local community. Neighbors often remarked on the family's polished appearance and seemingly happy life. To them, John List was the devoted father and husband, Helen the caring wife, and the children, model teenagers. No one could have anticipated that behind this facade of order and propriety, a darkness was quietly brewing, a darkness that would soon erupt into a tragedy that would shock the nation. It was within this carefully constructed home, a place that outwardly radiated comfort and stability, that the seeds of horror were about to take root. The lives of Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were about to be shattered, and the very walls that had symbolized order and security would bear silent witness to one of the most meticulously planned family annihilations in American history. Behind the carefully maintained image of order and respectability, John List's life was quietly collapsing. What neighbors saw as discipline and stability was, in reality, a fragile structure held together by denial, fear, and rigid belief. The most immediate pressure was financial. Despite the appearance of prosperity, the List family was deeply in debt. The large mansion on Hillside Avenue was expensive to maintain, and the family carried not one but 2 mortgages. Utility bills, tuition costs, and everyday expenses mounted steadily. For a man who equated financial success with moral worth, this decline was not just stressful, it was humiliating. In 1971, that pressure intensified when John List lost his job at the bank. Rather than tell his family, his church, or his community, he chose deception. Each morning, he dressed for work, left the house, and spent his days wandering train stations, libraries, and public spaces, pretending even to himself that nothing had changed. To admit failure would have meant shattering the image he had spent a lifetime constructing. As weeks passed, the lies grew heavier. With no income, List began draining his mother Alma's savings to keep the household afloat. The money disappeared quietly, but the guilt and shame did not. To John, this was not simply a financial problem, it was a moral one. He believed he had failed as a provider, a son, and a patriarch, and in his rigid worldview, failure was not something to be endured, it was something to be corrected. At the same time, John List became increasingly consumed by the idea that his family was drifting away from what he considered righteous living. His faith, once a source of comfort and structure, had hardened into something inflexible and unforgiving. He viewed the world in absolutes, right and wrong, saved and condemned. There was no room for nuance, forgiveness, or human weakness. This ideological rigidity extended into his home. List grew deeply concerned that his children, particularly his eldest daughter Patricia, were being corrupted by modern influences. He disapproved of her interest in acting and theater, seeing it as morally dangerous and spiritually threatening. To him, these interests symbolized a larger decay, a family slipping beyond his control and worse, beyond salvation. Helen, his wife, had also begun to pull away from the strict religious expectations John imposed. She attended church less frequently and challenged some of his rigid rules. For John List, this resistance was not seen as individuality or disagreement, it was rebellion. And in his increasingly distorted thinking, rebellion was a sign of spiritual failure. Psychologically, List was isolating himself. He did not seek help. He did not confide in friends, clergy, or family. Instead, he internalized every fear and frustration, allowing them to fester. His obsessive need for order and control, combined with his deep sense of shame, created a dangerous internal logic. If his family could not be saved in life, perhaps they could be saved in death. This belief was not impulsive, nor was it the result of a sudden emotional break. It was methodical, calculated. John List began to see himself not as a man facing hardship, but as an instrument of divine responsibility. In his mind, he was not contemplating violence. He was contemplating a solution. What made this phase especially chilling was how normal everything still appeared on the surface. The family continued their routines. The house remained spotless. Church attendance continued. No alarms were raised. No cries for help were heard. All the while, John List was quietly constructing a plan that, to him, felt logical, even necessary. By the time November approached, the pressures had converged into a single, terrifying conclusion. Financial ruin, perceived moral decay, and an unyielding belief system had fused together. And in the stillness of his own mind, John List convinced himself that there was only one way left to restore order, dignity, and salvation. What came next would not be spontaneous. It would be deliberate, and it would change everything. What followed was not an explosion of rage, nor a moment of panic. It was quiet, planned, and chillingly deliberate. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List woke up and followed his usual routine. There was no argument, no visible disruption. The house on Hillside Avenue was calm and orderly, exactly the way he preferred it. His children prepared for school. The day began like any other. But John List had already made his decision. After the children left the house, List turned his attention to his wife, Helen. Inside the kitchen, the heart of the home, he carried out the first act of what he believed was a grim necessity. There was no struggle reported, no evidence of hesitation. When it was over, he arranged her body carefully, treating the act not as chaos, but as a task to be completed. Next, he went upstairs to the third floor, where his mother, Alma List, rested in her room. Alma was elderly and dependent, and in John's distorted reasoning, she too had to be included. He would later describe this as an act of responsibility, ensuring that no one was left behind. With 2 lives already taken, John List did something that would later horrify investigators even more. He waited. When his daughter Patricia returned home from school, she walked into a house that appeared normal. There were no signs of panic. No disruption. John List carried out the same controlled routine, maintaining silence and order. Shortly afterward, Frederick, the youngest, returned home. He too was met not with chaos but with calculated finality. There was still one more. John List then left the house, drove to his son John Jr.'s high school soccer game, and watched from the sidelines. He cheered. He spoke with other parents. No one noticed anything unusual. After the game ended, he offered his son a ride home. Inside the house once again, the final act was carried out. By the end of the day, 5 members of the List family were dead. And yet, the house itself seemed untouched, almost peaceful. There were no signs of forced entry, no frantic destruction, no outward indication of violence. It was as if time itself had been paused. John List then began what he considered the final phase of his plan. He moved the bodies into the mansion's ballroom, placing them carefully on sleeping bags. He positioned them side by side, as though preparing them for rest. Alma's body was placed separately, in an upstairs room. To John List, this was not disorder, it was arrangement. He turned on lights throughout the house and left a radio playing religious music, allowing hymns to echo softly through the empty rooms. He adjusted the thermostat, lowering the temperature, an intentional act meant to delay discovery. Before leaving, John List sat down and wrote several letters. One was addressed to his pastor, carefully explaining his actions. He wrote not in anger, but in justification. In his words, he claimed he had acted to save his family's souls, protecting them from moral decay, financial ruin, and eternal damnation. He also sent letters to his children's schools and to the milkman, offering mundane explanations for their absence. The family, he wrote, would be away for some time. And then, once everything was in place, John List walked out of the house. The doors were left unlocked. The lights remained on. The music continued to play. Behind him, 5 lives had been extinguished. Ahead of him, an entirely new identity awaited. For the next several weeks, the house on Hillside Avenue would remain exactly as he left it, silent, illuminated, and holding a secret no one yet knew. In the days that followed, nothing happened. And that was exactly what John List had intended. The house on Hillside Avenue remained still. The lights stayed on, glowing softly behind closed curtains, giving the impression that life continued inside. The radio, left playing religious music, filled the empty rooms with hymns that echoed through hallways where no one walked anymore. Outside, the world moved on. Mail was delivered. Newspapers landed on the driveway. Milk bottles were left at the door. At first, no one questioned it. The List family had always been private, and absences were not unusual. But as days turned into weeks, small details began to feel wrong. The newspapers piled up, untouched. The mail overflowed from the box. Porch lights burned night after night without interruption. And yet, no one answered the door. John List had taken careful steps to delay suspicion. Letters arrived at the children's schools, explaining their absence as a family trip. The milkman was told deliveries were no longer needed. These simple explanations bought him time that allowed the house to sit undisturbed, preserving the illusion that the family would return at any moment. Inside the mansion, nothing changed. The thermostat remained low, keeping the rooms cold and slowing the natural passage of time. Food sat where it had been left. Furniture remained perfectly arranged. The silence grew heavier with each passing day, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Neighbors began to notice subtle inconsistencies. Lights that never turned off. Curtains that never moved. A family that seemed to have vanished without saying goodbye. Still, no one imagined the truth. The idea that something so horrific could exist behind those walls was unthinkable. John List, meanwhile, was already gone, moving steadily away from Westfield, leaving behind a life that no longer existed. He had disappeared quietly, without drama, blending into the background of a country full of strangers. And with each day that passed, the distance between him and the crime grew wider. Weeks went by. The house continued to stand in eerie defiance of time, its presence unchanged, its secrets sealed inside. To anyone passing by, it was just another home on a quiet street. But within its walls, 5 lives waited to be discovered. The stillness could not last forever. Eventually, concern outweighed politeness. Neighbors, unable to ignore the signs any longer, contacted authorities. Something wasn't right. A family couldn't simply vanish and leave everything behind. And so, nearly a month after John List walked out of the house for the final time, the silence was about to be broken. What lay beyond the front door had been waiting patiently, untouched, unseen, and exactly as he had left it. On December 7, 1971, nearly 4 weeks after the List family had last been seen, the silence finally drew enough concern to demand action. Neighbors could no longer ignore what they had been witnessing. The lights inside the house never turned off. Newspapers lay scattered and soaked on the driveway. No one answered the door. There had been no sightings, no explanations, and no signs of movement. What once seemed like privacy now felt unmistakably wrong. Police were called to the home on Hillside Avenue to perform a welfare check. Receiving no response at the door, officers made their way inside through an unlocked window. Almost immediately, they sensed that something was deeply unsettling. The house was cold, perfectly still. The lights glowed in empty rooms, and religious music drifted faintly through the air, playing to no one. As officers moved deeper into the mansion, the truth began to reveal itself. Inside the ballroom, they made the discovery that would shock Westfield, and soon, the entire country. Several bodies lay carefully arranged, positioned side by side, as if intentionally placed rather than hastily abandoned. There were no signs of forced entry. No struggle. No chaos. Everything about the scene felt deliberate. As the search continued, a fifth body was located elsewhere in the house. The realization was immediate and horrifying. The entire List family was dead. What unsettled investigators even more was the condition of the home. Aside from the presence of the bodies, the house appeared almost untouched. Furniture remained neatly arranged. Personal belongings sat where they had been left weeks earlier. It was as if life had simply stopped, frozen at the exact moment John List had walked away. Then came another crucial discovery. On a desk inside the home, investigators found a lengthy handwritten letter addressed to John List's pastor. Spanning several pages, the letter was not a confession written in panic or remorse. It was calm, structured, methodical. In it, John List explained his actions in chilling detail, claiming he had acted out of religious conviction. He believed he was saving his family from moral decay and eternal damnation. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness, only justification. With that letter, the case immediately shifted from a welfare check to one of the most disturbing murder investigations in New Jersey history. The evidence was clear. The suspect was obvious. John List was responsible for the deaths of his wife, Helen, his mother, Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. But the man himself was gone. Police quickly confirmed what the empty house already suggested. John List had disappeared. His car was missing. There was no sign of where he had gone, when he had left, or how far ahead he was. What had begun as an eerie silence had now become a full-scale manhunt. The house was sealed. The investigation expanded. And as the weight of the crime settled in, one question overshadowed everything else. How does a man commit such a calculated act and vanish without a trace? With the scene secured and the evidence pointing unmistakably to John List, investigators moved quickly. What they didn't yet realize was just how far ahead he already was. The first priority was to determine when and how List had fled. Police searched the house thoroughly, reconstructing timelines from mail deliveries, school notices, and the dated letters he had sent. It became clear that List had left the home shortly after the murders, weeks before anyone raised the alarm. That head start would prove devastating to the investigation. Attention quickly turned to transportation. John List's car was missing, and within days, it was located abandoned at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. Inside were no clear clues. No note. No indication of a destination. Investigators combed through airline records, suspecting he may have fled the country, but found no confirmed evidence that he had boarded a flight. The trail began to cool almost immediately. The FBI became involved, and John List's name was circulated nationwide. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. Tips poured in, sightings from multiple states, vague reports of men who looked similar, leads that promised answers but ultimately led nowhere. Each one consumed time and resources, only to collapse under scrutiny. Part of the difficulty lay in how ordinary John List appeared. He did not fit the popular image of a fugitive. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no known associates in the criminal world. He didn't drink heavily, gamble, or frequent places where he might stand out. He was, in every sense, forgettable. Investigators also faced another obstacle. John List had planned for this. He left behind no fingerprints of panic, no sudden financial transactions, no emotional outbursts that might suggest where he would go. Everything about his departure suggested intention rather than flight. As weeks turned into months, public interest grew, but progress stalled. The story made headlines, yet John List seemed to dissolve into the vastness of the country. Without modern databases, digital tracking, or surveillance technology, investigators were limited by the tools of the time. A man with discipline, patience, and a willingness to disappear could simply do so. Eventually, the case grew cold. The house in Westfield was sold. The List family was laid to rest. Life, slowly and uncomfortably, returned to normal for the community left behind. But John List remained missing, his whereabouts unknown, his fate unanswered. What investigators could not know was that John List had succeeded. He had not fled overseas. He had not hidden in the shadows. Instead, he had done something far more unsettling. He had started over. For nearly 18 years, John List lived under a new name, in plain sight, building an entirely new life, while the case bearing his real name sat unresolved, gathering dust. And it would take a breakthrough no one could have predicted to finally bring the manhunt back to life. For nearly 2 decades, the name John List existed only in old case files and fading newspaper clippings. To law enforcement, he was a ghost, a man who had vanished so completely that even his absence left no trail. But in the late 1980s, the case was about to be pulled back into the light by a force no one had anticipated. In 1989, the List murders were featured on the television program America's Most Wanted. Unlike traditional police bulletins, the show brought unresolved crimes directly into millions of living rooms across the country. It didn't rely solely on files and photographs, it relied on memory, on recognition. One major obstacle remained. John List no longer looked the way he had in 1971. To solve that problem, investigators turned to forensic artist Frank Bender, who used photographs, psychological profiling, and aging patterns to create a 3-dimensional bust predicting what John List might look like nearly 20 years later. The result was unsettlingly precise. A face that appeared older, heavier, and more weathered, but still unmistakably the same man. When the episode aired, the response was immediate. Among the viewers was a woman in Richmond, Virginia, who saw the bust and felt a sudden sense of recognition. The man staring back at her looked exactly like her neighbor, a quiet, well-mannered man known as Robert Peter Clark. He attended church regularly. He worked as an accountant. He lived a modest, unremarkable life. She contacted authorities. Investigators moved quickly. Background checks revealed inconsistencies in Robert Clark's past. Fingerprints were taken. Dental records were compared. Within days, the truth was confirmed. On June 1, 1989, John List was arrested. At the time of his capture, he had been living under his assumed identity for nearly 18 years. He had remarried. He had maintained steady employment. He had blended into society so completely that no one around him suspected the truth. To those who knew him as Robert Clark, the revelation was almost impossible to accept. When confronted, John List did not resist. He calmly acknowledged who he was. There was no dramatic chase, no confrontation, just a quiet end to a long disappearance. The man who had once vanished without a trace was finally in custody, undone not by a mistake, but by recognition. The case that had haunted investigators for nearly 2 decades was no longer cold. John List was extradited back to New Jersey to face trial for the murders of his wife, his mother, and his 3 children. And for the first time since 1971, he would be forced to answer for what he had done. The long silence was over. John List was returned to New Jersey under heavy security, nearly 18 years after the murders that had stunned the state. Time had altered his appearance, but not the gravity of what awaited him. The quiet disappearance was over. Now came judgment. The trial began in 1990, and from the outset, the prosecution laid out a case built on overwhelming evidence. There was no mystery surrounding who committed the crimes. John List had left behind a detailed confession letter. Ballistics evidence matched the weapons. The timeline was clear. What remained was not a question of guilt but of responsibility. The defense did not deny that John List had killed his family. Instead, his attorneys argued that he suffered from diminished mental capacity at the time of the murders. They presented testimony suggesting that List was affected by severe psychological stress, religious delusion, and undiagnosed post-traumatic stress stemming from his military service during the Korean War. According to the defense, these factors impaired his ability to fully comprehend the criminality of his actions. The prosecution countered this narrative methodically. They pointed to the planning, the purchase and use of firearms, the careful sequencing of events, the letters written to schools and service providers, the adjustment of the thermostat, the deliberate delay of discovery, and the calculated escape. These were not the actions of a man disconnected from reality. They were the actions of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and took steps to avoid consequences. Witnesses described John List's calm demeanor, both before and after the murders. Experts testified that while he may have held extreme beliefs, he was capable of distinguishing right from wrong. His religious convictions, they argued, did not absolve him of legal responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, John List remained composed. He showed little visible emotion. He did not weep. He did not lash out. When he spoke, he did so quietly, often framing his actions as tragic but necessary. To many in the courtroom, this lack of remorse was as chilling as the crime itself. On April 12, 1990, the jury returned its verdict. John List was found guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Sentencing followed shortly afterward. The judge imposed 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that John List would spend the remainder of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. The ruling was decisive, leaving no ambiguity about society's judgment. For the families of the victims and the community of Westfield, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but not peace. The damage inflicted could not be undone. The years lost could not be recovered. Justice, though served, arrived long after the harm had been done. John List was transferred to state prison, where he would live out his remaining years largely out of public view. The man who had once orchestrated a perfect disappearance was now defined by a single, inescapable truth. He would never be free again. With the trial over and the verdict delivered, John List disappeared once more, this time behind prison walls. He would spend the remainder of his life in custody, where he died in 2008 at the age of 82. There were no final confessions. No expressions of remorse that could offer comfort. The man who believed he had acted with purpose carried that belief to the end. But the story of the List family did not end with his death. In the years since, criminologists and psychologists have continued to study the case, often classifying John List as a family annihilator, a rare but deeply disturbing type of offender. These individuals do not act in sudden rage. Instead, they plan meticulously, driven by a desire for control, a fear of failure, and an internal narrative that reframes murder as justification. In John List's case, that narrative was built on a rigid belief system. His faith, once a source of structure, became a tool for moral absolutism. Financial failure transformed into personal disgrace. Independence became rebellion. And love, in his mind, became possession. What makes this case especially chilling is not just what John List did but how long he succeeded afterward. For nearly 18 years, he lived undetected. He worked. He remarried. He attended church. He blended into society so completely that those around him never suspected the truth. His capture did not come from a slip of the tongue or a guilty conscience but from memory, someone recognizing a face and refusing to ignore it. The List family murders also left a lasting impact on law enforcement. The case became a landmark example of how media exposure and forensic artistry could revive cold cases. The age-progressed bust that led to List's arrest changed how investigators approached long-term fugitives, proving that time alone does not erase identity. Yet beyond the investigations, the trials, and the psychological analysis, there is a quieter truth. 5 lives were lost inside a house that was meant to protect them. Helen, Oma, Patricia, John Jr., Frederick. They were not symbols. They were not footnotes in a criminal profile. They were people, caught in the private unraveling of a man who chose control over compassion and ideology over humanity. The house on Hillside Avenue is gone now, demolished years later after multiple failed attempts to sell it. But the silence that once filled its rooms still lingers in the story itself, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind respectability, routine, and belief. And perhaps the most unsettling question this case leaves us with is this: how many people like John List walk unnoticed among us, not because they look dangerous, but because they look ordinary? If you found this deep dive into the List family murders insightful, disturbing, or thought-provoking, consider supporting the channel. Dark Crime Case Files is dedicated to telling these stories with accuracy, respect, and depth, focusing not just on what happened, but why it happened. If you're not already subscribed, now is the time. New case files are released regularly. And as always, the darkest stories are often the ones hiding in plain sight.